July 31, 1971. On the dusty floor of a valley on the moon, a 250,000 miles from home, astronaut Dave Scott is about to do something no human being has ever done. He's about to get behind the wheel of a car. Not a car in any sense familiar to the people watching from their living rooms back on Earth. No roads, no traffic signs, no painted lines, no gas station down the block. No tow truck if something goes wrong. No mechanic waiting in a garage. No rescue crew standing by. Just Scott, his crewmate Jim Irwin, and a folded-up machine that has never once been driven on the surface of another world. It has flown 250,000 miles bolted to the side of a spacecraft, and now it's Scott's job to find out, in real time, whether it actually works. Before long, Scott will gun it, kick the back end sideways in the low lunar gravity, and send a spray of gray dust arcing through the airless sky, creating footage that will give audiences back on Earth a glimpse of something utterly unprecedented. To understand why two American astronauts were grinning like teenagers while fishtailing a car on the moon, we have to back up and start with a simple problem. Walking on the moon just wasn't enough. Think about the earlier Apollo landings. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, Pete Conrad and Alan Bean, Alan Shepard and Edgar Mitchell, brave as they were, pioneering as their missions were, they were all stuck on foot. And walking on the moon in a stiff, pressurized spacesuit is exhausting work. Every step is a bounding, awkward hop, more like a clumsy dance than a stroll. The suits are heavy and unwieldy, the ground beneath them uneven and treacherous, and astronauts only carry so much oxygen and cooling water before they have to head back to the safety of the lunar module. In practice, that sharply limited how far earlier crews could venture from their spacecraft. Even Apollo 14's farthest trek took its astronauts less than a mile from the lunar module before they had to turn around and retrace their steps. An entire alien world stretched out around them in every direction: mountains, craters, plains untouched since the beginning of time, and they could barely scratch its surface before their limited resources called them home. NASA knew that if Apollo was going to deliver real science, not just a flag, some photographs, and a handful of souvenirs, but a genuine geological survey of another world, the astronauts needed range. They needed speed. They needed, essentially, a car. That challenge fell to the crew of Apollo 15. Commander Dave Scott, a West Point graduate and veteran test pilot on his third spaceflight, a man who had already proven himself steady under pressure, and lunar module pilot Jim Irwin, on the only spaceflight of his career, about to have an experience unlike anything he trained for. Together with command module pilot Al Worden, who would orbit alone overhead while his crewmates explored below, they were assigned to Apollo 15, the first of what NASA called the J missions. Longer, more ambitious flights built around serious lunar science rather than simply proving that landing and returning was possible. And for the first time in the history of human spaceflight, they'd have wheels. That vehicle was the Lunar Roving Vehicle, or LRV, and building a car meant to drive on the moon was its own extraordinary feat of engineering, one that had to account for conditions no automotive engineer on Earth had ever had to design around. It was built by Boeing with its mobility system, motors and wheels engineered by Delco Electronics, a division of General Motors, bringing together aerospace ambition and automotive know-how. Fully deployed, it weighed only about 460 pounds on Earth, remarkably light, especially considering what it had to do, but it was tough enough to carry 2 suited astronauts, their tools, and more than 100 pounds of lunar samples across rough, unpredictable terrain. It ran on 4-wheel drive, with an independent electric motor built into each wheel, so that even if one motor failed out there, alone, with no repair shop for 250,000 miles, the rover could keep moving on the others. Power came from 2 36-volt silver-zinc batteries, quietly supplying the only source of energy for the entire vehicle, and top speed was somewhere around 8 to 11 miles an hour. Not exactly a sports car by any earthly standard, but on an unpaved alien plane in 1/6 gravity, plenty fast enough to feel exhilarating, even reckless. To get it to the moon at all, engineers had to fold the entire vehicle like a piece of furniture, and mount it in a compartment on the side of the lunar module Falcon's descent stage, a careful bit of packaging that had to survive the violence of launch and the vacuum of space. And here's the part that makes what happened next so remarkable. It had never been tested, fully assembled, in the actual conditions it now had to survive. Nobody could be completely certain it would even unfold correctly, let alone drive across an alien landscape with 2 lives depending on it. That uncertainty showed almost immediately. When Scott and Irwin deployed the rover onto the surface, unfolding it piece by piece under the harsh lunar sun, they ran into a problem with the front wheel steering, which wasn't responding. It would have been easy to see that as a crisis, a reason to pause or scrub the plan. Instead, Scott began the first traverse using only the rear wheel steering, working with what he had. The front steering began operating normally before the second traverse. It was a small human moment of improvisation, a test pilot doing what test pilots do, adapting on the fly, trusting his training and his instincts, 250,000 miles from the nearest help, with nothing but his own judgment and Irwin beside him to rely on. Once the rover was up and running, Scott took it out for what's become one of the most beloved moments of the entire Apollo program, the so-called Lunar Grand Prix. With Irwin operating a 16mm camera, Scott drove the rover through a short handling test, deliberately swerving and accelerating to see how it responded in the fine, powdery lunar dust. The back end kicked out. Dust sprayed up in slow, dreamlike arcs through the airless sky, then settled back to the ground in a way nothing familiar ever could. No air resistance to form a lingering cloud, no breeze to scatter it, just grains following clean, silent arcs back down onto a landscape that had never known tire tracks before that day. It was, on paper, an engineering test, a chance to gather data on traction and control. But watch the footage and it's unmistakably something more. It's joy. Pure, unguarded joy. 2 men on the moon, in the middle of a history-making mission, taking a moment to have genuine fun behind the wheel of the strangest, most remote car ever built. A car with no one else on the road for 238,000 miles in any direction. But the rover wasn't just for grinning at the camera. It transformed what Apollo 15 could actually accomplish, turning a mission of cautious, tethered footsteps into one of genuine exploration. With the LRV, Scott and Irwin could finally reach the terrain that mattered most. Hadley Rille, a dramatic, sinuous canyon snaking across the plain at the foot of the lunar Apennine Mountains, believed to be the remains of an ancient lava channel, a geological time capsule that scientists back on Earth were desperate to have astronauts examine up close. On foot, exploring terrain at those distances would have posed far greater risks given the limits of a spacesuit's oxygen supply. With the rover, it became another stop on the itinerary, a place to pull up, park, and get to work. Across their 3 moonwalks, Scott and Irwin used the LRV to rack up roughly 17 miles of driving, gathering rock and soil samples from locations earlier crews could never have dreamed of reaching, all while giving people back home a rolling, live tour of another world, mountains rising in the distance, a rill cutting through the plain, dust kicking up behind 4 dusty, bouncing wheels. That's the real legacy of that July day in 1971. The Lunar Grand Prix wasn't just a fun aside in the middle of a serious mission. It was proof. Proof that the rover concept worked, that human beings could drive across another celestial body and come back safely, that engineering triumph and pure human joy weren't opposites but could exist in the very same afternoon, on the very same alien plane. That success paved the way for rovers on Apollo 16 and Apollo 17, extending humanity's reach across the moon even further with each mission that followed. And here's the part that still gives people chills. All 3 lunar roving vehicles are still up there right now, parked where their crews left them, silent on the dusty gray plains, untouched by wind or rain because there is none to touch them. The only wheeled vehicles ever driven by human hands beyond the Earth. Half a century later, they're still waiting, a quiet, remarkable monument to a moment when a group of engineers and 2 brave, curious astronauts decided that exploring another world meant more than just walking on it. It meant driving on it, laughing on it, and, for one shining afternoon, simply having the time of their lives.